Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Devil's Advocate. My name is Han Yang. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Glenn Diesen from the University of Southeastern Norway. Professor Diesen has an Australian connection. Interestingly, he has been teaching in Australia for over a decade in Sydney. So, welcome, Professor Diesen.
No, thank you for having me on.
Professor Diesen is an expert on Russian diplomacy, foreign policy, and geopolitics. So let's start with the breaking news with the Iran war. Apparently, the United States military gonna blockade the Hormuz Strait for any ship coming from Iranian ports starting in a few hours' time. And what do you think is gonna happen? Is this gonna cripple the Iranian economy so much as to ask the Iranian to surrender, or do you think the Trump will tackle first because of the resulting high oil price?
Well, I do think that the approach that Trump likely will embrace is to form some kind of a blockade on Iran to essentially, starve the country in terms of energy or food access, whatever it might be. So I think you see this from the attacks on the railroads, roads, bridges, and of course the naval blockade, something to essentially cripple the country. I think that's what they're going for. To what extent this blockade will work, well, if this was the magical silver bullet that will take care of everything, it's unclear why they haven't approached this before. So I see many different flaws with it. For instance, are they going to block all ships? Are they going to fire upon Chinese ships? What if the Indians get access? Are they going to stop them? Are they only going to go after the Iranian ships? It's still unclear what the blockade is supposed to be able to achieve and how it actually addresses the rest of the international system, which won't consider it to be very legitimate that the United States is stopping their ships from accessing. Otherwise, I think it's also from the operational perspective, it's going to be difficult to achieve. If they get too close to the Iranian coastline, they will be vulnerable to attacks. And furthermore, as this war has demonstrated, the US has attempted to have complete escalation dominance. That is, it should choose, for example, which countries should be involved, what are legitimate targets. The Iranians have shown that they're not following these rules, that they're able to essentially follow the Americans up this escalation ladder. So for this reason, if they start to strike or take a stranglehold on Iran, they threaten, for example, to destroy the desalination plants. Well, the Iranians have mountains. They have access to other sources of water. If the Iranians retaliate against the Gulf states, take out their desalination plants, they're left in a desert. So it's, the Iranians can go up this escalation ladder with the Americans. I think that's the main message here. But this reeks of desperation, I think, but I could be wrong.
Well, it is quite desperate because only a few weeks ago, Trump lifted the sanctions on Iranian oil. Now he's doing the exact opposite. So we don't know exactly what his exact approach is going to be next.
No, that's a good point because they need to stabilize the market, so they reduce sanctions not just on the Iranians but then also on the Russians. So it is interesting that they can't afford to let the prices get out of control. On the other hand, they now want to put this blockade because they want to strangle Iran. I don't think they're sure what to do because more or less they have to accept at some point defeat, that they can't achieve what they want to achieve. And but they also can't admit defeat because if they can't go home and declare victory as long as the Strait of Hormuz is under Iranian control. Essentially, if the Iranian puts up a toll booth there, which they already have at the Strait of Hormuz, then they can do many things. They can extract the money from the ships that pass through, which will then essentially be reparations, which allows them to rebuild. They can also use this to pressure other countries in the region to not host hostile American bases that would decouple the US from the region. They can press them on, for example, trading only in the Chinese yuan or at least non-dollar in their energy, which would then destroy the petrodollar and also again decouple the US from the region. So there's a lot of things the Iranians can do. What the US can do is bring a lot of pain to Iran. It can carpet bomb cities, kill a lot of civilians, infrastructure, create shortage, economic problems. But whenever Trump says we killed their leaders, we destroyed their air force, all these things, it doesn't really do much, because the weapons the Iranians need to close down the Strait of Hormuz are relatively cheap. And also, if you bring enough pain, anyone will give up. But for the Iranians, this is an existential threat. They know very well that if they give up, let's say they give up their conventional weapons, or give up the regional partnerships, now they're going to be much weaker the next time, which is probably only a few months away, when the United States and Israel come back again. So if the Americans are successful, that is regime change without a replacement government, we're looking at possibly the balkanization of Iran, at least making it into a new Syria. So I think this is why the Iranians sees it as an existential threat, so they can't afford to back down, and they have the means not to back down. So for this reason, I think that Trump's tendency to measure success in terms of how many people have been killed or what he's been able to blow up, it doesn't really make much sense.
In your view, do you think the Iranian military escalation, like attacking the Gulf states' infrastructure, is it a rational choice by the Iranian government?
Yeah, they can't strike American cities, American refineries, so they're going after the frontline states. So these frontline states, they participated in the attack on Iran. So I think for Iran, these are legitimate and also rational targets. The United States itself doesn't have to be an existential threat to Iran. What makes the US an existential threat is this forward deployment in these frontline states. So they're essentially imposing a cost on them for hosting these bases and essentially assisting in the attack. Now, I don't think that they're all that passive, which they would like to portray themselves as. At least we're told in this New York Times report that not only the Israelis but the Saudis had pushed the Americans very hard to attack Iran. So it's a little bit like they're hosting American troops. They're encouraging them to attack Iran, and once Iran is attacked, they declare themselves neutrals and not participating in this conflict. I don't think this is very likely, but it's very convincing. But they're also easy targets for the Iranians, and not just in terms of proximity, but if you want to create some real pain, this is really the vulnerability of the United States, because a lot of these countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they have a massive part of the population, especially Qatar, 85 to 90% are essentially foreign workers. They're completely dependent on energy exports, and they're exported through strait, which Iran can shut down. So for this reason, if they destroy the energy facilities, then the economies are over. If you create some instability, this 85 to 90% of the population might actually leave. So you shut down the water, the desalination plants, then they have to leave. So I think overall, the Iranians have a lot of cards to play if they want to go up the escalation ladder. And again, the targets in the Gulf states are easy and a key target.
All right. So let me link this to the issue of Ukraine war, the area of your expertise. Do you think Ukraine also faces existential threat right now, with its cities being attacked by Russia and millions of people displaced? So by your own standard, with the Iran standard, shouldn't Ukraine be equally justified in seeking maximum Western military support to ensure its own survival? And why do you think the existential threat legitimizes Iran's escalation but not Ukraine's resistance?
Ukraine faces an existential threat. They're having their country destroyed. They're already stripped of 4 regions plus oblast plus Crimea. And if their army collapses now, the Russians will likely seize 4 more. That is Kharkov, Dnipro, Nikolaev, and Odessa, making the country possibly landlocked. They have millions of people which have fled. They have had hundreds of thousands dead. The country does face an existential threat. The Russians now view the extent of a threat of a NATO-aligned Ukraine to be so severe that I think if there was a way of essentially ending Ukraine, that is breaking it up into smaller pieces, they would balkanize it any day, I think. So Yeah, I think it's very reasonable to consider Ukraine to be facing an existential threat, and for this reason, it's not difficult to understand why the Ukrainians have fought so hard, and I think they understand a lot of this. This is, of course, part of the problem for the Russians when they push this hard, is that face an existential threat, the Ukrainians are willing to go to a much greater length to defend themselves. So this can. So no, I don't see that big of a difference between this. The problem, of course, is that Russians also consider themselves to be facing an existential threat. That is, if NATO enters into Ukraine, or Ukraine enters the NATO orbit, so they're also willing to fight this to the very end. So it's a very, very dangerous situation instead. But if you want to understand why the Ukrainians have fought so hard, been able to absorb all this pain and still continue after more than 4 years, it's exactly because they quite reasonably do face an existential threat.
Why do you think Russia faces existential threat from NATO? I mean, didn't Finland and Sweden join NATO last year, and Russia didn't react? And the three Baltic states joined NATO, and Russia didn't invade them. And Russia didn't invade Poland or didn't invade Bulgaria, any other Eastern European countries. Why is the possible potential joining NATO by Ukraine poses an existential threat for Russia?
Well, they see Ukraine as being a very unique country in this regards, if you want to destabilize Russia. So not only is this something that can cut off the Russians from the Black Sea, which is why this war has also to a large extent been about the Black Sea. This is why it took Crimea so fast after the regime change there in 2014. So, for this reason, it's also the. I mean, if you listen to part of this reports from the Washington Post and New York Times about why it was important to get Ukraine into the NATO orbit or America's orbit, it was also because of the long. And not just the long front lines. That was important as the US began to set up a partnership with the Ukrainian intelligence services the first day after the coup in 2014, several secret CIA bases along the border. They were also important to infiltrate within Russia because of the deep relationship the Ukrainians and Russians had for so long. It's not just shutting down the Black Sea, but it's also the population size. If you want any proxy to be used to severely weaken Russia, it doesn't have any strong neighbors on its western borders besides Ukraine, with 35 or 40 million people. It's seen as a key vulnerability. So this is why, again, it's not my opinion. This is what we learned in 2008 when NATO offered future membership to Ukraine. At that point, you had people like the CIA. He was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, which is William Burns, later became the CIA director. He wrote this famous memo where he said that if we try to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit in terms of making it a member, first thing that will happen is likely a civil war within Ukraine, because more than half the population didn't want to be a part of NATO, and then at this point the Russians would likely intervene. He added reluctantly so, because this would be a horribly messy war, but they would, because this is seen as an existential threat. This is why Angela Merkel at the same time also said that if we try to get Ukraine into NATO, the Russians would interpret it as a declaration of war. So we knew the severity for the way the Russians saw it. Whether or not we agree with that Russian assessment that as an existential threat is kind of besides the point. It can't be any doubt that the Russians see it this way, and for this reason, the Russians will act upon their conviction. So if they believe they're facing an existential threat, they will fight to prevent it. This is why I've been very critical of NATO essentially saying, after this war, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. What you're telling the Russians is whatever remains of Ukraine is going to become a NATO frontline. Now, if you're sitting in the Kremlin, then what you want to do is you want to strip Ukraine of all its strategic territory and destroy everything that remains in terms of critical infrastructure. So I don't think we're doing the Ukrainians any favors at all by essentially, publicly saying we're going to make them a NATO member in the future. If we want to help them, I think we should remove them from the front lines of this geopolitical rivalry in a divided Europe, and not make them exposed as the way they become.
Well, you argue that the West must acknowledge Russia's legitimate security concerns about NATO expansion as a root cause of the Ukraine war. Does the same logic apply to Israel? Doesn't Israel see Iran as an existential threat from Iran and its proxies? So and the threat is way more serious than any potential threat posed by Ukraine to Russia. So isn't Israel justified in its attack on Iran in that sense?
Well, there's some difference. I do think that Iran can pose a threat to Israel, also because it supports the Palestinians to a great extent. But then you're describing, well, the Israelis are a threat to Iran as well, as they've been trying to get the United States into a war against Iran for decades now. What you're describing, I think, is the basis of the international security architecture that is international security. I mean, whenever we assess international security, the point of departure is the international anarchy. That is, all countries compete for security. If country A and country B, each of them wants security. If, the United States gets more missiles, it doesn't translate into more security. Now there's insecurity for the Chinese. Now China has to arm itself. That's insecurity for the US. So there's always a security competition. And if you face a threat, Iran faces a threat from Israel faces a threat from Iran, it's not a great reason to start attacking them. If anything, and I think given that the war against Iran was bound to fail, it would only achieve the opposite. The Iranians will now make sure they arm themselves to the teeth. If they can't trust a conventional deterrent, they will get a nuclear deterrent. So I think that this doesn't help the security competition at all. They're going to end up in a much worse situation. So the way I think is different from the Ukrainian issue is Ukraine, there wasn't a security competition there. If you go back to 2008, the vast majority of Ukrainians didn't want to be a part of NATO. NATO itself had this report coming out in 2011 where it essentially complained that the problem with the NATO partnership with Ukraine is that most polls find that barely 20% of people want to be a part of NATO. So this was the problem. But by trying to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit, then what the NATO did was it created a security competition, because now Ukraine without NATO was never a threat, which is why the Russians never put any claim to Ukrainian territory, not even Crimea. They didn't demand any of this. Once the government was toppled in 2014, it looked like they would be gradually pulled into the NATO orbit. Then massive security competition began. The Russians saw an existential threat, and they began to take action. And then they attacked Ukraine in a manner which makes Russia an existential threat to Ukraine. So now both Ukraine and Russia is locked in a battle for their existence. My point was that if none of this existed before NATO started pushing its expansion into Ukraine, this is what triggered a security competition. I think in the Middle East, there will always be a security competition, not just Israel and Iran, but Iran and Saudi Arabia. And there has to be, usually the way you overcome the security competition is through, different means. You have more transparency, you have collective security agreements, you have ways to reduce these tensions. I don't think any of this has been pursued. Indeed, the Israelis and Americans have made it very clear that they're not prepared to live together with Iran in the neighborhood. For the past 47 years, they've looked to undermine Iran. So, and to be honest, sorry.
But doesn't the same criticism apply to Russia as well? Did Russia try any transparency, any peace initiative with Ukraine? Rather, Russia basically just started invading Ukraine, taking Crimea first, and then started full-scale invasion. So that same criticism should apply to Russia as well.
Yeah, just to some extent. I think when Zelensky got elected in 2019, he was in a very vulnerable position. He faced the West didn't care for any rhetoric of getting along with the Russians or making peace with Donbass. He was also exposed to the nationalists. I think at that point the Russians should have offered a real olive branch in order to settle things and reduce the tensions. Instead, they took a very maximalist position towards him. I think this was a massive mistake. It only increased the tensions. But what's interesting with the European security architecture, though, I mean, if you ever wanted to do a social experiment where, because in the security dilemma, you can argue both sides contribute. But in the beginning of the 1990s, we got to run a social experiment. What happens if the Soviet Union dissolves, and out of this you have Russia, and Russia says essentially, we can walk away from our empire. All we want to do is to join Europe, and that's what they asked for. Since Gorbachev's time in the 1980s, he was pushing this common European home. In 1988, in December, he announced that they would pull out of the out of Eastern Europe, to pull back 500,000 troops. In 1989, they declared an end to the Cold War, and then we moved forward. In 1990, we got what we wanted. We had a new deal for a common European security architecture, which was the Charter of Paris for a New Europe. In 1994, we established then the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is an inclusive security organization. And the Russians made it very clear their goal was to simply be one out of many normal European countries. They even ignored the traditional partnerships in the East because they wanted to align with the West. However, they got weak, and the Americans decided, instead of having this inclusive security architecture, let's pursue hegemonic peace. And the hegemonic peace is achieved through alliance systems, where your adversaries are well balanced and your allies remain the security dependent. So we pursued NATO expansion, and I think the objective of this liberal peace or hegemonic peace was NATO expansion. This was the manifestation. So over the years, though, initially Boris Yeltsin and Putin both suggested we can join NATO. They suggested we don't mind Ukraine joining EU or NATO as long as we join too, so we don't create a dividing line between us. They suggested in 2008 a new European security architecture. 2011, they proposed an EU-Russian union. At every turn, the West rejected them. In 2013, when the West was destabilizing Ukraine, the Russians and Ukrainians came forth and said, let's do a trilateral agreement so Ukraine doesn't have to choose between East and West. The West rejected it. They said Ukraine have to choose. When Ukraine chose wrong to turn down the EU deal, they toppled the government. So it's not as if the Russians didn't try, but even after 2014 and 15, when we had the Minsk peace agreement, it was based largely on the autonomy of Donbass, which they saw as an opportunity to keep Ukraine neutral. It was the West that started to arm the Ukrainians and undermine the Minsk agreement. So I don't think it's fair to say that the Russians didn't try to create a common European home, an inclusive security architecture. Doesn't mean they're perfect.
Sorry to interrupt, but Russia didn't exactly follow the Minsk agreement either. They sent their troops there. And I don't think either party has stick to the agreement.
Well, that's technically it's not a breach because the Minsk agreement was a deal between Kiev and Donbass. I know it's often portrayed as if it's a deal between Kiev and Moscow. The Russians are part of this deal. If you look up the Minsk II agreement, it's not between the Russians and Kiev. Now you can argue that Moscow interfered to a great extent, and I would agree with this. They often pretend as if these were volunteers from Russia coming into Donbass, but and yes, technically it was so, but it's a little bit like the way you have Western troops in Ukraine today. They could enter on a volunteer basis, but when they come back home, they have promotions, they can move up the ranks, so it's rewarded. It's still organized by the state, and they're rewarded accordingly. So I don't think the Russians haven't done, they haven't contributed to the disaster we're in. I think they could have done things differently as well. But my point is that they largely reacted, imperfectly so. And, I would have hoped they hadn't invaded Ukraine. But nonetheless, I think they nonetheless responded to the security competition, starting with the toppling of Yanukovych.
You talk about NATO expansion as if this is purely an idea from America and Europe. But what about the agency of the Balkan states and Eastern European states and Ukraine? Don't the people of East European countries, they have their own agency. They wanted to join NATO because for their own security concerns. So don't they have their own agency rather than it's a push by the West to expand NATO, rather than those countries, those people wanted to join NATO for their own protection from Russia?
Well, some, but not all. I think when the Cold War came to an end, the interest of many countries, for example, Poland and the Baltic states, They didn't want, because the agreements we first had was to remove the dividing lines. Was what was achieved with the Charter of Paris for a New Europe. We were going to have a Europe without dividing lines based on indivisible security. So one side shouldn't enhance its security at the expense of the other side. So this was essentially an argument against bloc politics, what we're supposed to overcome after the Cold War. But for countries like Poland, for example, or the Baltic states, they didn't want the dividing lines to be removed. They just wanted to be on the other side. And you can understand why. If you lived under Moscow's rule for the decades, you don't necessarily want to have the Russians into the club. You want to maintain the dividing lines, just be on the other side. And essentially that's what they pushed for as well. So no, if you would have any democratic vote over a referendum, they would have joined. Well, the Baltic states didn't have very democratic referendums because they didn't let Russian speakers participate. But nonetheless, you can say across Eastern Europe, there was a strong desire to be a part of NATO, to get away from Moscow's shadow. But as I said before, this was not the case with Ukraine. And this is something that is well reported in all polling, essentially, from 91 to 2014, that the vast majority of Ukrainians did not want to participate in, they did not want to be a member of NATO. If they had to choose, most of them would have chosen a partnership with Russia. However, if you would look at all the polls, what most of them would say is, we don't want to choose. That's actually what you hear from the Belarusians as well. If they have to choose, they will choose Russia, but most don't have to choose. They want to be a bridge, not a front line in a divided Europe. So I think this agency doesn't, I don't think this applies to Ukraine because the decision was made for them. Of course, now that the Russians have been bombing and killing them for so many years, would you have the vote today, they would definitely join NATO. But it depends what should be the rule about joining NATO. Is this the new rule that international peace is advanced if you just allow any country to join any military bloc they want? I don't think so. I think countries on the border of other great powers, they should have a lot of rights. And I think Ukraine should have the same rights as, say, Mexico. And Mexico can enter any political partnership or economic deal with any country in the world. But if the Chinese and Russians began to establish military bases in Mexico, I can guarantee you that every city in that country would be bombed to the ground if necessary to have those removed. So I don't think this is simply how great power politics work. Great powers will not allow other great powers to establish themselves on their borders. And I don't think that's how security is enhanced either. This is why if you want security, you have to address the security competition. That's why you find inclusive security architecture. And that's what we had that's what we're moving towards in Europe before we saw Russian weakness in the 90s and decided to expand NATO instead.
So if you think Russia invaded Ukraine out of legitimate security concerns, does this justify the United States take over Venezuela, Cuba, and Greenland? Because according to Donald Trump, they are very vital to the security of the United States.
Yeah, but well, first of all, I don't think anything legitimizes to take over or conquering the countries. I don't like the idea of we have two different concepts. I think a sphere of influence and a sphere of interest is different. A sphere of influence suggests that great powers should have exclusive influence on their borders. And I don't think anyone should. I don't think the Russians have any right to exclusive influence in Ukraine, or the Americans or Chinese counterparts have any similar rights. But a sphere of interest is different. That's not exclusive influence. That's about recognizing that when you're on the border of another great power, then you have to take into account their interest. In other words, if the Russians or Chinese are working with Mexico, whatever they do inside Mexico also affects the security of the United States. Now, arguing this is very different from saying that the Americans have exclusive influence in Mexico. But no, I think to carve out the region, I think it was right that neither China or Russia went in militarily to help Venezuela, because I think establishing yourself militarily on the border of another great power is a disaster. I think they're more likely to assist Iran, because this is not in America's backyard. But it's not in the right of America to demand exclusive influence. And that's essentially what the Venezuelan mission was about. The Venezuelans would have accommodated trade with America. They could have sold them oil. But what the Americans wanted was for them to cut off oil exports to China and to other rivals of the United States. So what the U.S. is seeking is exclusive influence. I don't think this is a direction that the world wants to go.
So let's. So Russia has one of the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and what exactly is it afraid of NATO?
Well, it's not one of them. I think it's the largest. They're slightly bigger than the United States, or it depends how you measure it, I guess. But no, they have a nuclear deterrent. But again, a nuclear deterrent that doesn't always do much. You see this now, for example. The NATO countries don't seem to be too concerned about launching long-range missiles, which are operated by, and just to make sure that's clear, these ATACMS, Storm Shadow missiles, which are launched, they're operated by Americans and the British contractors. They are also that their targets are picked by Western intelligence and the war planners. They follow, So these are to a large extent direct attacks by NATO, but we do it allegedly through a proxy, even though the Ukrainians might not be involved. And we also see now drones striking up in St. Petersburg. There's no way that these drones were, that they could have transited through all of these countries without being within NATO, without being noticed. Furthermore, the mere direction or the length of the travel suggests that they weren't even launched from Ukraine. They might have been launched from Finland or the Baltic states. So I think that if you listen to the Europeans, for example, they don't even talk about nuclear deterrence. They call this Russian nuclear blackmail, which means we can't respect it, because then we reward the Russians. So I don't think the nuclear deterrent is working as it necessarily should. And this is why it's if there would be a war with Russia as it's now, it's not going to take the form of a first strike necessarily, a nuclear strike. I think there's going to be used by a proxy. This is why the Ukrainians are, dangerous. If you have another country, it wouldn't be so dangerous, but because they have such a huge territory and huge population, they make a very ideal proxy. NATO's not going to have a similar opportunity in the future to destroy Russia than what they have now using Ukrainians. So I think that's also why it's different, for example, than Finland or Sweden. But no, I think, well, obviously, if you watch the war of the past few years now, they have reasons to be concerned.
Since the end of World War II, the Soviet Union has invaded Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Afghanistan, and Russia has invaded Georgia and has annexed Crimea and attacked Ukraine. But for the last 7 decades, Soviet Union has never been attacked by any other neighbor countries. So let's go back to my question. What exactly is Russia afraid of? They have never been invaded by any neighbors, and they have been the invader instead. They have been attacked other countries, neighboring countries. So in terms of security concerns, their neighboring countries shouldn't then have more legitimate concerns about Russia's threat rather than vice versa? Well,
if you look towards the end of World War II, you had people like Truman who argued very openly that if the Nazis are winning, we should help the Soviets. If the Soviets are winning, we should help the Nazis. So I think that the objective is to weaken your adversary. It didn't mean that the Americans, saw how short-lived the peace was thereafter. The British, I forgot the name of it, but they had a plan to attack the Soviet Union. It was made in May. They were supposed to attack in May.
But they didn't.
No, but this was not for a lack of trying. They had their own, I forgot the name of it, they had their own plan to attack the Soviet Union, where they would get the US cooperation with this, and they would enlist the former German soldiers out of Nazi Germany to join in and attack them at the end of the war. It didn't happen, but my point is that there was no intention after World War II to live in peace with the Russians. So for this reason as well, the Russians were very sensitive about having a buffer region, so this is why they went in with a very heavy force, be it preventing their buffer state, which under Brezhnev Doctrine didn't allow them to have a full sovereignty, made sure that they didn't drift away and would become end up within the Western orbit. I'm just saying this is how the security calculations was from the Soviet Union. Doesn't mean that it's legitimate or if it's justified, or the Czechoslovakians or the Hungarians didn't have the right to live in peace or have their own sovereignty. I don't think the Brezhnev doctrine of limited sovereignty is an ideal one at all in any ways. I'm just saying this is how great powers behave. They, this is if Central America begins to drift too closely to China, the Americans will feel insecure and they will react in a similar way. I don't think it's not about legitimacy or respecting or believing that this falls within international law. It's simply how great powers react. And I think we often delude ourselves by saying, well, that's not right, that's not just, let's just ignore this. We don't need it. Russia shouldn't, in normative sense, have any say over what happens in Ukraine. On one level, I understand. I don't think it's, Ukraine is a sovereign country, they should decide themselves. And this is a very normative position. But in the real world as well, we know that we're not doing any favors by pretending that this is the rules of the game, because it's not the rules of the game. If we knew all along, if we tried to pull Ukraine into NATO orbit, the Russians would destroy it. That's not a statement of support or any suggesting is justified, but the same would apply to Mexico. If the Chinese or Russians try to bring it into their orbit, put their missiles there, the Americans will destroy it. I wish it wasn't so, but because it is so, I know that it's not. I wouldn't consider it pro-Mexican to put Russian missiles into Mexico. I would think this would be a death sentence for it, just like NATO signed the death sentence of Ukraine when they toppled the government in 2014 to bring it into the NATO orbit.
Let's talk about, just apply your standard great power politics. The European countries as a whole, the European Union, their GDP is 8 or 9 times larger than Russia. So in terms of a power status, the European are much more powerful than Russia in that sense. So doesn't that justify, in your interpretation of the power politics, that's why the Europeans should and have the resources and have the power to arm Ukraine to make sure Ukraine is secure from Russian threat?
Well, it depends. There wasn't any Russian threats before they toppled the government, and I think that's the main flaw of the whole argument. That is that we have in NATO, which is that we went in to help the Ukrainians because, as I said, when you go back to 2014, it was a small minority of Ukrainians who wanted to be part of NATO. This idea that NATO is this altruistic organization that wants to spend all its resources on helping weaker countries, it's a nice way of selling wars, but it's not why they went in. We know why they went in, and this is to have the Ukrainians as a proxy. Again, this is what the New York Times wrote as well. That is the first day after the coup, the very first day, the new intelligence chief of Ukraine, which the Americans helped to install, the first thing he did was to call MI6 and CIA to establish a trilateral partnership for covert war against Russia. So this is not something you do if you want to help the country, because what you do is you trigger security competition, and the Ukrainians will be destroyed. So I think I don't think that this helps anyone's security. Again, it goes back to the idea that simply more weapons and more alliance systems helps support security. I think it's it's a false assumption. It goes against the whole premise of what security depends on.
So you keep talking about Russia's legitimate security concern. To what extent, when the line crossed into just simply Russia trying to restore this imperial influence or imperial boundaries of this former empire. So how do you differentiate legitimate security concern or simply just greedy land grab to restore its former glory of imperialist Russia?
Well, there shouldn't be the collapse of the Soviet Union. If someone misses it or not is besides the point. The Soviet Union is gone. You have now 15 independent states, and I don't think history gives any legitimacy for Russia to annex any neighboring countries. It depends why we think there's a war. And I think what you refer to is kind of the key dividing lines, because when Russia went into Ukraine in 2022, the main slogan you got out of every NATO government and their media outlets was this war was unprovoked. Now, what does unprovoked mean? Well, there was no reason for this. It came out of nowhere. So if this happened in a vacuum, it wasn't provoked. Why did the Russians do it? Well, then the only answer is they want to restore their empire. And I think this was an important narrative for NATO, because if the Russians are simply trying to restore their empire, you can't have diplomacy with them. You can't have any compromise, because this merely rewards them, and whatever they get in Ukraine, it will embolden them to continue. This is the purpose of the unprovoked narrative. But as we know, it was very much provoked. It was recognized by many Western leaders, political, military, intelligence leaders, that this was immensely provocative for the Russians. Now, if we accept that it was provoked, that means suddenly in 2014, the Russians, which haven't even talked about taking back Crimea, suddenly woke up and decided they want to restore the Soviet Union and have a Russian empire. I just don't see that that's the case. I think we built a very powerful narrative that the Russians suddenly wanted the Soviet Union back, but they very much reacted to the security competition.
But the way President Putin talked about Ukraine doesn't help your argument. Is this because Putin himself dismissed the Ukrainian concept of Ukraine? He insisted it should be part of by history or by culture or by any connection. It should be part of Russia. So Putin himself doesn't really help your case. He is basically saying it should be part of the Russian Empire, the Ukraine.
Well, yeah, that's one of the problems of having this war gone on. But this rhetoric didn't exist before. Until 2014, none of this rhetoric existed, and I think it's become much harder over the past few, not just months, but years now. And part of the reason, I think, is they're essentially delegitimizing the entire concept of Ukraine, because they don't see the possibility of returning back to a neutral Ukraine. So I agree. I see the same coming from Dmitry Medvedev as well, where he refers to so-called Ukraine or State 404, this kind of things. And I think this is to legitimize stripping a lot of its territories. Also, the argument was, this new Ukraine is becoming permanent. That is the hatred of Russia. And the key problem is a lot of the territories in Ukraine today, it used to be part of the Russian Empire before. Odessa was a Russian city. Kharkov was seen as a Russian city. So what they're essentially saying now is something different than they did back in 2014. Now they're more or less, implicit or sometimes explicit, saying that, we had all this. How many was it? 17 million, or a lot of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers living on what was historical Russian lands, which we allowed to remain a part of Ukraine, we essentially they broke the social contract when they decided in the new Ukraine the Russians will be second-rate citizens. The ethnic Russians, we're not going to have the Russian language anymore. We're not going to accept the Orthodox Church. We're going to purge Russian culture. We're going to purge the political parties which are seen as being favorable to Russia. They essentially say, well, under these conditions, you don't have the right anymore to rule over historical Russian lands and Russian peoples. So they're withdrawing it. Again, I'm just making the point. This is not a statement of support of stripping Ukraine of its territory, of its people. I'm just saying, as this war drags on, I think the rhetoric from the Russians is going to get harsher and much uglier as well. And I agree with you. What you're seeing now is essentially contesting the legitimacy of Ukraine as a state. I'm just saying this didn't exist. I think up until at least 2020.
So you acknowledge Russia's invasion is a war of aggression, but most of your book, the Eurasian Order, you argue that it was, as you mentioned before, it's strategically understandable. So, but legally and morally, does perceived provocation ever justify a full-scale invasion of a sovereign country?
No, morally no, I don't think it's moral to invade other countries. I don't think, the whole idea of war and morality is also problematic. But no, what I said is, I think that, as I said before, the narrative is important, because if we say that it was unprovoked, whenever I say that it was provoked, in Europe, all they hear is, well, then you're legitimizing the Russians, you're justifying their invasion. No, that's not my point. If we recognize that this was provoked, which it was, now there's a possibility, there's a pathway to peace. We can find a diplomatic settlement. It's NATO that toppled the government. There was NATO that disrupted the equilibrium in the system. It was NATO that triggered a security competition between Ukraine and Russia. So it was NATO that started this war back in 2014. That doesn't mean that it's legitimate to invade the country or strip it of its territory. I'm just saying, once you recognize that it was provoked, now we have a pathway to peace. you can find a way of finding a security architecture which also includes the Russian security concerns. Because we don't talk about Russian security concerns, we don't have a security architecture that recognizes it in any way. So this is the problem of a hegemonic peace, which is what NATO expansion is. Now, in contrast, if you say it was unprovoked, it sounds, in Europe, it sounds good because then you're laying all the blame on Russia. But what in reality means is we can't have any compromise with Russia. Our leaders can't even speak to the Russians because they think diplomacy means rewarding the Russians. And this will essentially be a war till the end, a war which we can't win. So it's a unmitigated disaster. So I don't think we're doing anyone a favor by deluding ourselves that this war was unprovoked. But again, it's nothing about, I wouldn't put any necessarily legitimacy or moral virtue towards the invasion of Ukraine, stripping it of its territory.
So do you think that Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, is it strategically a good decision or a bad decision? Just compared it to the US decision to attack Iran, both are highly questionable strategic decision, and both has basically drawn the US and Russia into a lot of great economic uncertainty, has a lot of grave economic consequences. So in that sense, do you think both decisions in terms of Iran war and the Ukraine war, both are wrong strategically?
Well, if you take the humanitarian aspect and legal aspect out of it, I would say I'm not sure to what extent the Russians had exhausted other opportunities. If they saw Ukraine being pulled into the NATO orbit as an existential threat, the way they saw it was they had been trying for more than 30 years to create a common security architecture which would also respect Russian security and not gradually move NATO's military infrastructure closer and closer to Russian borders. Now, I think the Russians saw themselves, if they had exhausted all options, I don't know, but at least they had attempted for a long time other alternatives in which they ended up in a situation where they reluctantly invaded. Again, that's not even my words. That is, as I said before, the former CIA director William Burns, who said that the Russians would feel compelled to invade, even though that's not something they would want to do. And on the other hand, with Iran, I think it's very different. I don't think the United States made any efforts to make any peace, to live with them at all over the past 47 years. As I said before, the Russians are the ones who pushed the hardest with different formats for a common European security architecture. The United States did no such thing. Yeah, I'm just saying that they did the opposite. They withdrew from the JCPOA. They had twice negotiations, which allegedly was close to a deal, when they used this as an opportunity to launch surprise attacks. I think the Americans won't accept any deal except the destruction of Iran. Again, they're looking for a hegemonic peace. That's not what the Russians were doing.
Well, you mentioned that the United States have been, for the past 47 years, been never trying to engage with Iran. But President Obama did sign the deal with Iran, even though it was overturned by Trump later. But that's an exception. So your point about the U.S. has been consistently trying not engaging with Iran, but that's wrong, is it? Because President Obama did engage with Iran and had quite a successful deal.
Yeah, and when this is the whole point. You saw after September 11 as well, the Iranians were trying to become a partner of the United States, someone they could work with to normalize the relations. So my point is on the other side, that is on the Iranian side, they always had the possibility of peace. When President Obama reached out to the Iranians and said, hey, let's make a deal, the Iranians signed it. Even after the Americans didn't fully live up to the deal, they continued to abide by it. They continued to have the inspectors from the IAEA with quite intrusive inspections. They accepted all these things. So if the Americans wanted a partner in Iran, they could work with the Iranians. All I'm saying is that the Russians, they never had anything. They kept making requests to the Europeans and the Americans if we can have a deal which respects the security of all, and they never got anything from them. So at the end of the day, they saw military option as being the only one. In other words, they believed that they had exhausted the diplomatic possibility, especially after the West sabotaged the Minsk agreement as well for 7 years. What I'm saying is that the Americans didn't face this kind of a hostile opponent. They had if they reached out to Iranians, the Iranians would try to make a peace deal with them. So I don't think they were under the same pressure as the Russians were to apply military force. But it's because they have a different system in the international system. That is, the Americans, they are looking to before maintain, but now to restore global primacy. The Russians don't have any capabilities or intentions for any global primacy, so they're in a position where they're willing to make more deals. The Americans do not agree to main compromise. You don't have a hegemony with compromise. You have to defeat and subordinate your opponents.
Going back to my question before about how has the war affected Russia, what's your assessment of Russia now after 4 years of war with Ukraine? How is its economy? How is its social fabric with these casualties from the front line? How is the country doing? Is it better off or worse off after 4 years of war?
Well, I think what is more favorable, I guess, is much quicker to go through, which is they decouple themselves to some extent from U.S. economic levers of power. So they made themselves more independent from U.S. technologies, from U.S. industries, U.S. transportation corridors, U.S. banks, currencies, and the Red Sea.
But they're more dependent on China now.
More so than they would want to, because ideally in a multipolar world, what you want to do is you want to diversify your economic connectivity. So I think ideally the Russians wouldn't want to invest this heavily into the partnership with China, because China's economically much more powerful than Russia. So if you put all your eggs in the Chinese basket, this is problematic to the extent that the Chinese are much more powerful than Russia. So ideally the Russians want to diversify their ties, which is why they're reaching out, for example, to India, might even host them now more in the Arctic, because they don't want to put all their eggs in the Chinese basket. Ideally, the Russians would also have good relations with the Europeans, the Americans, and I think that's why they responded well to Trump's re-election as well, because he communicated this. This being said, I think overall you can't fight such a high-intensity war for 4 years without problems. It's taking a toll on many industries within the country, also the social fabric. I mean, they had tens of thousands of killed. You're going to have a lot of people with trauma returning back to society. Also, any society that undergoes wars is not great. You will have a government which emerges a bit more authoritarian. They're going to be a bit more aggressive. It can set a precedent for the future. So no, overall, I think war is rarely good for any society. So I think it would be ideal for them to put a very quick end to this. The problem is that not a little bit, just like the Iranians also want to put an end to this, but they see this as an existential threat. The Iranians are essentially saying if they don't get a permanent deal from the Americans, they will be back in a few months. The Russians are saying the same. If we get out of Ukraine today, then NATO will move in tomorrow. So they need a deal which restores Ukraine's neutrality, and also essentially gives them control over these 4 oblasts which they took from Ukraine, because this is seen as a way of permanently securing the western flank. But overall, no, it's not good for society. Possibly, yes, some economic benefits from avoiding American rent-seeking, but beyond this, no.
What do you see the potential of the so-called no-limit partnership between China and China and Russia? I came from China myself, and from what I understand, the Chinese people are deeply, deeply suspicious of Russians, because throughout history, China has been invaded by Russia in the Imperial times. Russia taken a lot of Chinese land in the 19th century, and even at the end of World War II, the Russian troops pillaged throughout the Chinese northeast, and through the Cold War, China and Russia and Soviet Union has been at odds. So the Chinese are very suspicious of Russians, and the Russians are very suspicious of Chinese. So they don't have any shared values. Unlike, say, although Trump is doing his best to damage it, but the Europe and America is still linked by shared value, democratic values and ideals to some extent. So that doesn't exist between China and Russia. So how do you see the future of that partnership? Is the so-called no-limit partnership, but there is a limit, isn't it?
well, there's a limit on everything, but I think that there's of course historical distrust. You see the same with Russia and Iran for that sake. That's why the Iranians would always be very careful to develop excessive dependence. That is also why they would be critical of having any Russian bases or weapons stored in in Iran, even if it would be to help Iran. I mean, historical mistrust tends to linger on. But of course, it's improving though, and that's one of the things, not just with Iran, but you're seeing now with China as well. And I think they're, to a large extent, they become the ideal partners, because if you look at this greater Eurasian partnership, which they're both aspiring to do, that is to integrate economies of greater Eurasia, that is from the technologies, industries, the transportation corridors, banks, currencies, payment systems, all of this, they kind of need each other. For the Russians, you can't create an alternative to the US hegemonic system without China. China's the only country in the world with the capacity and the intentions to challenge the United States. And also for the Chinese, you see that there's an interest in accommodating the Russians, because they occupy a very important part of the Eurasian continent. So I think they all have different visions for what they want to achieve in Eurasia, but the main thing is that they can't really achieve what they want without the cooperation of the other. And I think this is why, I remember I wrote a book on Russia's geoeconomic strategy for Greater Eurasia a decade ago, and I was working in Australia then, and I kept hearing, but they will clash over Central Asia, and I made a point. I don't think they will, because none of them needs to dominate that region. All they need to make sure is that the others won't dominate. So I think, and you see this is very different, because China doesn't have the same hegemonic approach as the US or the NATO has in general. So, for example, when NATO engages with with the Central Asia or Ukraine, whatever it is, a key objective is always to decouple that region from Russia. You see a very different non-hegemonic approach by the Chinese, which is when they enter Central Asia, they're careful not to step on the toes of Russia. In other words, they respect an influence of a sphere of interest. That is, once you operate on Russia's borders, it has historical ties to it. Don't try to decouple that region from Russia. Instead, they try to harmonize their interest. So I think this is quite different. And also, I know, it can be good with common values in terms of having more that unites, but it's also something that diminishes sovereignty. Once you claim to have the same values, and then what makes you distinctive? I think for the Chinese, they also have a non-hegemonic approach to this regards. They're making the point that each civilization is different. They all have the different approach to modernity, and for this reason, they don't seek to impose their model on others. Whenever countries talk about universal values, that's exactly what they are doing. They're trying to impose their model on others. So I think a lot of this, the fact that the Chinese aren't claiming that they represent all humanity, it's actually reassuring the Russians that this is a Westphalian system that is of distinctive civilizations which seek to harmonize their interest to reduce the security competition. So I mean, doesn't mean you throw common values out the window. I'm just saying there's always a dilemma. There's some plus and some minus.
Well, let's talk about China's. You mentioned you think China's non-hegemonic intentions, but China is building artificial islands in the South China Sea and trying to claim a vast area of those sea to Chinese territory, even though they are pretty much closer to the many other Southeastern Asian countries. So doesn't that contradict your point about China being a non-hegemonic? With China's military and economic power growing, doesn't it will necessarily translate into projection of military power and territory expansion? Well,
on one hand, I would say that if you look in towards the Chinese concerns, a lot of what they're worried about is the two island chains of the United States. That is, that you can say that there's a security competition going on, because if the US didn't try to contain China, if the US didn't have this immense military pressure or presence in the region, then the Chinese wouldn't be under such a pressure to establish influence within this within the South China Sea and this 9-dash line. But I do agree that with the rise of Chinese capabilities, I think intentions could change. I mean, as a political realist, I tend to think that capabilities shape intentions. That is, if China gets overwhelmingly powerful, it becomes any ideologies of global primacy or representing all of humanity, this universalist ideals, it will begin to look very appealing and seductive. So, but I don't think it will be able to manifest itself in the same way it did in the United States, because the US, we lived in a very unique time in human history. That is when you only had one center of power. I don't think this can happen. And but again, this is also a reason why we want to make sure that the countries like India, Russia, Iran, they have many partners, because if they become excessively dependent on China, China can build up a massive amount of power. If it becomes too powerful, they might begin to embrace in the future, that is, ideologies of or policies of hegemony, and I don't think that's in anyone's interest. Others will point to Chinese history, saying that that they're inherently wouldn't speak a lot with Jeffrey Sachs. He makes this point that China's history suggests they're not inclined towards hegemony. I tend to lean a bit more in the realist way, saying that, well, if the opportunity comes, if the Chinese can pursue a hegemonic peace, then they might do so as well. But this is why we want to establish a multipolar world, because at the moment, what we see the Americans doing, for example, they, as Hillary Clinton said in 2012, the Eurasian Economic Union, which institutionalizes a lot of Russian influence in Central Asia, we want to sabotage this because we believe that it re-Sovietized the region. Well, now that region will gravitate more towards China because of its economic power. If you cut off the Indians from Iran, now Iran will gravitate closer to China as well. So I think what the Americans are doing, they're pursuing policies of a global hegemon, which doesn't exist anymore. And all they're doing is disrupting the equilibrium and strengthening their main rival. So given that the peer competitor is China, I think it's in America's interest to support a multipolar system. Because even China's best friend, which is Russia, if the Chinese became too powerful and began to become too arrogant towards the Russians, that is trying to dictate their policies, for example, or threatening to take back these territories they lost, in these humiliating agreements, then the Russians will begin to lean more towards the West instead. So I think this is a good thing in the multipolar system, that you have mechanisms built in to balance aggression. This is the whole point of the Westphalian modern world order, which America's aspirations for global primacy derailed.
I don't think Professor Jeffrey Sachs' understanding of the Chinese history is correct. I mean, China used to be an empire, and an empire didn't become an empire by peaceful means. I don't think, being Chinese myself, I don't think the Chinese are inherently peaceful, or the Russians are inherently violent, or the Americans inherently. Every country, as you said, it's a political realist. When you possess the capability, and you will expand your territory throughout history. So I think Professor Sachs is quite naive in describing the Chinese as kind of inherently peaceful people, and I don't think that's a correct understanding. Every ethnic group basically share the similar, I think, tendency to expansion and violence when the opportunity comes throughout history. That's the world order before the United Nations was established, right? And also, to your point, you mentioned that the Chinese expansion in the South China Sea is more a reaction to the U.S. containment strategy with its military bases around the region. But the counterpoint is, don't those countries that hosted the bases have their own agency? A lot of those Southeast Asian countries, they have their very historic concerns, security concerns about China, about Chinese expansion, because they suffered from this throughout history. And don't they have agency? They have consent. They wanted American military presence as a security partner, especially, say, the Philippines.
Yeah, no, this is, again, this is the problem of the international system, is this international anarchy. And I think this is also a tragedy of the great power politics, which is that if you're a country living next to a great power, if you live next to United States, you live next to Russia, you live next to China, throughout history, you will probably have your sovereignty violated many times, because that's simply states don't constrain themselves. They tend to impose themselves on the neighbors. For this reason, it's quite natural for the neighbors to want to seek protection, and then they reach out to other great powers. The problem is, once another great power establishes itself on their border, that creates a huge threat to this power. This is why the Americans were willing to go to nuclear war to get the Soviets out of Cuba. Cuba had, has its, through history, its sovereignty violated by the United States. They wanted the Soviets there to help them. But once you invite another great power on your border, that great power threatens, it constitutes an existential threat to the US, which is why then the US was willing to go to nuclear war to deny Cuba its sovereign rights and agency to host the Soviet Union there. Now, I think it's the same you can say with Ukraine. They also, if you're in Ukraine now, if I was Ukrainian, I would definitely want some support from other powers, given the way that Russia has violated their sovereignty and their security. But again, if you invite NATO in there, this is only signs your death warrant, much like it did almost in Cuba. Now, I would say that the same applies with China's neighbors. They have every reasons to fear a huge, powerful China on their border. But once they invite the United States, because like all other great powers, the US isn't in Philippines for altruistic reasons to simply help Filipinos. They have their own interests. They want to weaken China as a rival power. So I think this is important. We always talk in defense and protection, but this is the problem. We have an offense-defense dilemma here. Whatever reason you invite them in is not the reason they stay. So I think they have reasons to fear China, but once they invite in the United States, they make themselves frontline states against China, and now they have they will essentially face China's defensive concerns. I mean, we have the same problem in this country. I live in Norway now, and we have a border with the Russians up in the Arctic. The politicians in this country say, "Oh, the Russians, they're scary. They're a big country. We're 5 million. They're 145. We need protection, so we get America here. Now we're going to open American bases across the northern regions." None of these people ask why. Why are the Americans here? Do they have the same interests? Are they using all these resources only to come and protect us? No. They have an interest. They want to cut off the Russians in the Arctic. So we're making ourselves a frontline state against the Russians. But this is the security dilemma. You want to be secure, so you arm yourself. You develop alliance systems, and then you instead threaten the opponent, the other side, and you invite military aggression. So I think, be it Philippines, Norway, Ukraine, Cuba, they all, can walk in this trap.
Most analysts agree that the coming flashpoint, or the only possible reason the US and China are going to have a military conflict is over Taiwan. So what do you think with the Iran war? What's its impact strategically and logistically for the US for its commitment to protect Taiwan? What will be the impact?
Well, I think that's the problem of the United States now, because a key challenge for the United States is when it's recognized that the world was becoming more multipolar, that it was getting actually peer rivals. That's when you saw in 2016 Obama saying we have to pivot to Asia. This essentially meant we have to strengthen our military in East Asia to contain China because it's growing too fast. And if you're going to pivot to somewhere, you have to pivot away. And they want to pivot away from Europe and the Middle East. This is also very much built into the national security strategy of December of 2025, that this is how you adjust to a multipolar world. You can't be everywhere. And ideally, that's what America should do. Get your troops out of Europe, the Middle East, and have them in the Western Hemisphere and more in East Asia. But the war against Iran is essentially doing the exact opposite. You're seeing now that weapon systems, the Patriots, the THAADs, being sent out of places like South Korea and sent to the Middle East instead. At the same time, the South Koreans are watching the US being unable to protect its Gulf allies, and it's seeing the mistreatment. Maybe I'm biased because I'm European, but mistreatments of European allies. So for this reason, they're going to ask themselves, which they are, why are we betting everything on the US defending us? Because by having US troops, you trigger a security competition. We make ourselves a front line against China, so we make ourselves a threat to China, but if something happens, the Americans won't be here to protect us. That's essentially what you're seeing now with the Gulf states. So they might. So I think that this goes against essentially the strategic objectives of the United States, which is why I think it's a great folly to engage in this war with Iran. Besides the fact that it won't be won, but no, I think China might even take advantage now because they see what the Americans do over the past few years. They try to chip away at Taiwan at every turn to try to well, essentially decouple it or sever it from China. If you're sitting in Beijing now, you might think, you know, if the Americans are completely bogged down in the Middle East, maybe it's time to put this Taiwan issue to bed and just take it back by force, because the Americans will never permit us to integrate it through peaceful means. So
do you think the next 2 years will be a golden opportunity for Beijing to make a move?
Yeah, I think, well, it is a golden opportunity because they know America will never will push for Taiwan's secession in the future. But at the moment, the Americans are bogged down in the Middle East. So it is a golden opportunity. Whether or not they will take that golden opportunity or whether it's a good idea, I'm not sure about that. I tend to be have a strong aversion to war. So I would, and also, you know, the whole idea of integrating Taiwan through military force, I think, you know, it's a little bit like Russia using military force in Ukraine. In 2014, the majority of Ukrainians favored partnership with Russia. Today, there will be a deep hatred towards Russians for decades to come. So I think military force comes with a great cost, and it's also very unpredictable. You don't know how the Americans going to react, you know, when the desperation and humiliation sets in. So if I was advising Beijing, I would say this isn't a golden opportunity, but I wouldn't take it. But, you know, but there's a risk of it, of course.
Well, I guess you compared Taiwan and Ukraine. There is quite some similarity. And also, let's talk about the agency of the Taiwanese people. The Taiwan has had its own democratic governance, has its own military, judiciary, and currency for over 7 decades. So do you think Taiwanese people have some agency or have the right to determine their own future?
Depends what you mean, right. It's, I mean, you can say from a normative perspective, every region, every part of the world, everyone should determine their own future. But that's simply not the case. If you know, if parts of Spain want to secede, they can't secede. So we don't talk about the right to do so.
But Taiwan is quite different because it has never been under any jurisdiction of the People's Republic of China, the communist government, since the end of the Civil War. So unlike Spain, say the Basque area, they already in Spain and they want to succeed, and that's quite a different issue because with Taiwan they've already been separate from the mainland and has never been ruled by the mainland government. So that's quite a different reality, isn't it?
No, I'm just thinking how to interpret the question, because I guess from a normative perspective, I would say, you know, yeah, we should all, you know, live and let live. Everyone should be allowed to decide their own path. You can argue that Taiwan has its own borders, it's governed itself, it has a distinctive national identity. Well, you know, this is all true, but at the same time, the reality is that China considers this to be inherently a part of China. So if one pushed for the secession of Taiwan, this will trigger a Chinese response. So I don't think it's achievable. And so again, if I was advising Taiwan, I would say make a deal with China, either to preserve the status quo or have some kind of a, you know, even though it's flawed, some kind of a Hong Kong deal of extended autonomy. But I just what is realistically possible in the international system, you know, it doesn't permit it. So it's like having Ukraine. It sounds wonderful. If you would have a poll today, most Ukrainians would want to join NATO probably. So, but you know, if say, okay, that's what they want, they have the right for agency, they have their own country, they have their own national identity, they have the right for their own country, they have their own country, why shouldn't they make the sovereign decision if they want to join NATO today? Again, 2014 they didn't want to, but today they do. Well, you know, from a normative perspective, I said, yeah, sure, why not? You should do what you want. But that's not how international security works. the Russians would never permit it. So it would never actually happen. We would end up in a nuclear war before that happened. And I think the same applies to Taiwan. If they try to secede, there will be a war. It's I don't know. It's unthinkable to believe that the Chinese would accept it. So while I would say normatively, yes, they have the right to do what they want, I would strongly advise against it.
You said that it's better to keep the status quo, but that's the whole point, is it? Because the mainland doesn't want to continue the status quo. The status quo is Taiwan is de facto independent because it has its own political system and identity, and the mainland, the communist government, doesn't want to continue this status quo. They want to change the status quo. So many people, especially the anti-American commentary, would say it's always the US trying to provoke a war at Taiwan Strait. But I think, isn't it the only possible factor to start a war is if the Beijing decides to take over Taiwan?
Well, at some point, I think the status quo acceptable to Beijing would be that Taiwan operates as it does now, and it will integrate through peaceful means, that is, economic means and all. But if it fails to achieve it through these means, it could use military power. So, but in terms of so what I said was I would aspire, if I'm Taiwan, to try to extend what the status quo is today. But no, China's not going to accept any independence. So, but extending or continuing or extending the current ambiguity, I think that's the best they can hope for. But more realistically, over the long run, they would probably have to accept something of having extensive autonomy. But it's very hard to see what else can be achieved. Again, one can say, well, they should do this, but if they declare independence tomorrow, they will end up.
I don't think anyone is pushing for formal independence, because everybody realized the risk, and also there's no point, because Taiwan has been de facto independent as an entity. So the status quo is good enough.
But the status quo, it probably wouldn't last anyways, because if the power distribution in the world remained constant, then the status quo could go on in perpetuity. But it isn't. Then we see that this tremendous shift in power from the west to the east. That this spectacular rise of China. It disrupts everything. So if you sit in the United States, what are your calculations? Well, the Taiwanese are only going to get strong. The Chinese are only getting stronger every day. So if you want to. So over time, Taiwan will slip away the way you see it. So the Americans have an incentive to disrupt the status quo as well. What they want to do is, now that they have a military advantage, begin to chip away at the sovereignty of China by dismantling the One China policy. So begin to send more military advisors, soldiers. So essentially, if you go back to Carter, he said that the One China policy meant that the U.S. engagement with Taiwan should be limited to the cultural and economic sphere. Now you see more political and military every day, and also pushing for a special status perhaps for Taiwan within the UN. So they're trying to dismantle the One China policy now while they can, because time is not on America's side. Even if China wouldn't take over as a larger power than the US, which it probably will, but at least in China's own region, they will have more and more power. So I think that America's time is not on their side. I think time is on China's side, and that's why it's in China's interest to delay it, because if you have more and more economic power, it's more possibility of integrating Taiwan peacefully. And if it isn't possible peacefully, then if it has to go through military conflict, it's better to wait another 10 years when China's position is going to be much more favorable compared to the United States. So I think this is the reason why Taiwan is becoming a massive tension, is this power shift as the relative power of China is increasing so fast that the former status quo doesn't work anyways. So my question is, what is Taiwan going to do? If I was Taiwanese, I would think what's possible to do. And if they're going to go with the American way and dismantle the One China policy, then I think they would be destroyed. There would be another Ukraine, essentially. What they should do now is try to get the best possible deal. No. So at some point they're going to have to make peace with being part of China, and I would try to carve out as much autonomy as possible. whether or not this can be trusted, or if it will become more of a Hong Kong issue where it gradually tears away. I don't know, but it's yeah, you change what you can change, but you have to also accept what you can't change.
Right. I think that's about it. Time is up. So thank you very much, Professor Diesen, for your insights. And hopefully when you come visit Sydney, we'll get meet face to face.
Sounds good. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.